Good morning and welcome to the APPAM webinar on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or the DACA policy. I'm so glad that so many of you are joining us this morning, and I wanted to let you know that this is also being recorded so that we will have an opportunity for folks to hear it who are not able to actually be on the call this morning. My name is Cynthia Osborne, and I am an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm also the chair of the Professional Development Committee for the Policy Council for APPAM. And so I have the privilege of being able to moderate this great panel that's going to share with us today a lot about what we know about DACA. We have three wonderful speakers who are going to be joining us. Matt Hall from Cornell University is going to provide to us an overview of DACA and tell us about the background of it and some of the legal challenges and other things that are currently going on. Sayil Camacho from Vanderbilt is going to be talking about the policy implications of DACA. Of eliminating DACA, rather, both on kind of economics and employment, on public health and education. And Julia Gillette is going to share with us more about what is next, and if DACA is fully eliminated, what are the replacements for DACA, what are some of the legal issues, and where do we go from here? As many of you may know, DACA is a program that provides not a pathway to citizenship, but it provides some temporary protection from deportation for and the ability to work legally for a group of about 800,000 immigrants who are undocumented. And in 2017, President Trump ended DACA and encouraged Congress to try to address this issue legislatively, although to date the policy is in the courts and we haven't had any legislative resolutions at this time. And so today's call is really to try to understand how DACA and the rescission of DACA is affecting these families who are in danger of their work permits expiring, that they're facing potential deportation with ICE stepping up its operations. And we want to understand what this means from a policy perspective, what the research says, and where we might be going from here. We're hoping that this conversation informs academics who are studying this, practitioners who are working in the field to try and help these families or these individuals, and policymakers who are grappling with what we should do next. So I wanted to note to all those who are joining us that on the GoTo webinar, there is a box in your right-hand corner that allows you to ask questions. And we encourage questions throughout. If you could, please direct your question to a particular speaker so that I will know who it is that you're looking to try to respond to your question. And we'll get to your questions largely at the end of end of their presentations. Each of them will talk for approximately 10 minutes, and we will have plenty of time for conversation and discussion at the end of that. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Matt Hall, who is an associate professor at Cornell's Population Center, and I will let him introduce himself a bit more about his experience with DACA and immigration policy writ large, and to share more about the overview of the policy. Matt?
Well, thanks, Cynthia. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this discussion about DACA and its impacts, and thanks to APPAM and especially to Cynthia and Megan for organizing all this. As some brief background, like Cynthia said, I'm an associate professor of policy analysis and management at Cornell, and I also help run the training program at the Cornell Population Center. I'm a demographer by training, and I have done a good deal of work studying the impact of unauthorized status on the lives of immigrants, their impact on local communities, and more recently the policy responses, including DACA and TPS, that try to address these migrants' precarious position. So what I'd like to do now is to provide some brief context on DACA, discuss what the rescission means, and introduce some of the legal context. And we'll go into much more detail on each of these throughout the course of the next 20 or 30 minutes. So first, what is DACA? So DACA is, of course, shorthand for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program. And this was implemented by the Obama administration in 2012 after Congress repeatedly failed to successfully pass what was called the DREAM Act. And the DREAM Act would have actually provided a clear pathway to citizenship for the roughly 1.5 million undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children. And this is the group that we commonly refer to as Dreamers. The DACA program was launched via executive order by President Obama in June of 2012 by effectively expanding and formalizing the pool of individuals who are eligible for what's called prosecutorial discretion. And this ostensibly allowed resources to be freed up at DHS that were necessary for them to prioritize the deportation of those who pose more serious threats to public safety. And so this program corresponded with a shift in deportation priorities that the Obama administration pushed for and that the DHS implemented. So unlike the DREAM Act, DACA does not provide a pathway to citizenship. In fact, like Cynthia said, it doesn't even provide any change in legal status. DACA recipients, who we sometimes refer to as documented migrants, are indeed still unauthorized. So what DACA does is it provides two things. One is that it provides a temporary promise that recipients will not be deported. And secondly, it gives work authorization. That is, it gives what's called an EAD, or an employment authorization, that allows recipients to secure legal employment and to also obtain a Social Security number, which then allows them to obtain state ID cards. There are a number of important eligibility requirements in order for individuals to qualify for DACA, such that not everyone who arrived as a child is eligible for this program. The three most important pieces of eligibility are, one, that the applicant arrived to the United States before age 16. Second, that they have completed high school or some high school equivalent program. And third is that they have not they have not been convicted of any serious crime. So Migration Policy Institute, who has done some of the best work on this topic, has estimated that about 1.3 million individuals meet these requirements, but just about half of this likely eligible population has actually enrolled. And so there's a current total of roughly 700,000 recipients, but probably closer to 800,000 who have ever received DACA. It is also really important to remember that because of the educational requirement, that is that applicants must have completed high school, there are another likely 400,000 children who would actually age into DACA eligibility. But those children currently lack any sort of legal or bureaucratic protection at the moment. And another important observation about the DACA population is that it varies very widely across states and across origin groups. So a couple of key points that I want to mention. One is that the vast majority of DACA holders, as you would expect, hail from Central America, with about 550,000 of those from Mexico alone. But it's important to keep in mind that there are non-trivial numbers from all around the world, particularly from Korea, from the Philippines, from South America, and as well as the Caribbean. If we're looking just in the U.S. and looking at the spatial distribution of the DACA population, it's no surprise that DACA recipients are concentrated in a handful of long-standing immigrant destinations, particularly in California and Texas, who combine for about half of the total. But there are also substantial DACA populations throughout the Mountain West, especially in Arizona and Colorado, and in the Southern Atlantic, and particularly in Georgia and North Carolina. So what does the rescission mean? So the future of the program is very much in jeopardy, as President Trump announced last September that the Department of Homeland Security would stop accepting new applicants, and that renewals for existing recipients would not be considered after March 5th of this year. The administration has argued that the creation of DACA represented executive overreach that instituted a fundamental change in immigration policy and law, but without congressional approval. So I'll briefly talk about some of the legal challenges in a minute, and Julia is going to elaborate more fully on those and on DACA's future a little bit later on. But let me say a few things about the programmatic impact if DACA were in fact to come to a complete end. So first is that obviously the most direct and the biggest impact would be on the recipients themselves, who number about 700,000 in total. And this means that upon expiration of their status, they would be vulnerable to deportation and would lose their authorization to work. Both these are hugely consequential, but the second one almost guarantees that employed DACA recipients will lose their jobs because federal law prohibits any employer from knowingly hiring anyone without work authorization. The Migration Policy Institute, again, estimates that close to 2/3 of the DACA population is in the labor force. So the immediate impact could be as high as 400 to 450,000 individuals, and obviously the total number is much larger than that, given that most of the remainder are still in school. Second, it is not clear how many employers would actually be affected, but the number is likely very large, given the DACA population's presence in the labor force. Not only would firms lose workers and the skills they have invested in, but they will bear the cost of terminating the employment of potentially productive workers and finding their replacements. The Cato Institute estimates that the turnover cost to employers would be about $6.3 billion, and these impacts would be particularly large in industries where DACA recipients concentrate, in food services, in retail sales, and construction. And then lastly, it's important to remember that the reach of the DACA protections expand well beyond the recipients themselves and include the children and the families that DACA recipients are a part of. So we don't have great data on this, but we have some information that indicates from a survey that was conducted by United We Dream that suggests that about 1 in 4 DACA recipients have a U.S.-born child that is a U.S. citizen a child, and that a majority of them have immediate family members who are U.S. citizens, and so the full impact of any sort of rescission has very broad and sweeping impacts on these families. Sayo will talk in much greater detail about these impacts in just a minute, but let me say a quick word about some of the legal challenges and where we stand. So the reality is that the DACA program remains very much in legal limbo. In January of this year, a federal judge in the Northern District of California issued a nationwide injunction on the rescission of DACA that required DHS to resume processing DACA renewals. In February, a federal judge in the Eastern District of New York also ordered renewals to resume. And then last month, a D.C. federal judge expanded the injunctions and ruled that DHS must accept new DACA applications, but stayed the decision for 90 days. The Justice Department has appealed the case to the Ninth Circuit, and states have also responded in some important ways. In September, 15 state attorney generals, led by New York's recently ousted Eric Schneiderman, sued the Trump administration on grounds that the rescission was cruel and will do harm to state economies. And last week, Texas and 6 other states sued the federal government on grounds that the Obama administration overstepped its authority and called on the district court to rescind and cancel all DACA permits. So I'm going to pass it off now to Sayo, who's going to talk more about some of the impacts.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate that. Sayo Camacho, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Vanderbilt University, is going to, as Matt said, talk a bit about both the policy and the social implications of eliminating DACA. Sayo?
Yes, thank you. I'm also a formerly undocumented person and currently work closely with the Tennessee Immigrant Rights and Refugee Coalition, Most recently, I helped develop an undocumented training at Vanderbilt University as a means to advocate and institutionalize resources for undocumented students. I'm happy to support you in engaging in this work, and we will provide our contact information at the end of the webinar. So, in conversation with Dr. Hall's overview of DACA, DACA is the most impactful federal immigration policy since the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. We should keep in mind that though DACA has shielded approximately 800,000 from deportation, the Migration Policy Institute estimates that 1.3 million undocumented youth were eligible to apply for DACA when it was announced. There are currently 11 million undocumented people living in the United States. Since DACA has provided the inroads for recipients to realize their professional and academic aspirations, 91% of DACA recipients are employed. DACA recipients are not just providing for themselves, but significantly contribute to their families' financial well-being. As we can imagine, DACA has had a profound and positive impact on the recipients' quality of life and actualized the betterment of their families, communities, and the U.S. economy. If the canceling of DACA were to go into full effect, roughly 30,000 recipients would lose their work permits per month as their DACA expires. The Center for American Progress has estimated that the loss of DACA workers would reduce the U.S. gross domestic product by $433 billion over the next 10 years. Given the disparate numbers of DACA recipients in each state, the economic impact would be felt unevenly across the country. The graph on the left-hand side illustrates the economic impact by state. For example, in California, there are an estimated 233,000 DACA recipients, and California would suffer an annual GDP loss of $11.3 billion, whereas Texas would lose approximately $6.3 billion, and North Carolina would lose $1.9 billion. Though the GDP loss is smaller in states where there are less DACA recipients, the impact for undocumented immigrants and their families is the same, and arguably worse for people that live in states with dramatically different immigration policy climates. As an example, I live in the state of Tennessee, and the immigration population is about 5%, but 37% of the immigration population is undocumented. Last month, we experienced the largest immigration workplace rate in over a decade, and Tennessee House Bill 2315, which is currently in recess, would require the police to collaborate with ICE. So I'm sharing this because in a moment, I'm going to discuss the economic and labor benefits of DACA. And as we review these statistics, we need to simultaneously consider the implications of the current social political climate for the 11 million undocumented immigrants and their mixed status families. There are many economic and labor benefits that the DACA program has actualized for the U.S., and here are a few. DACA recipients increase financial resources for social programs and lower the economic deficit. DACA recipients pay more into the tax system than they take out. Specifically, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy estimates that DACA recipients have paid about $2 billion in state and local taxes and $470 million to Medicare taxes. To provide more context, the Social Security's chief actuary found that undocumented immigrants contribute 13 times more revenue into the program. Also, the parents of DACA recipients do not and cannot receive social benefits, even though they pay into that system as well. As we know, these social welfare programs are available to all U.S. citizens. A survey conducted by the Federal Reserve in 2017 found that there is currently a shortage of qualified workers in the United States. Ending protections for DACA recipients would not only worsen the shortage of workers in the country, but would prohibit an educated workforce from formally participating in our economy. Despite the education challenges that they faced as undocumented students, approximately 81.4% of DACA recipients have graduated from high school and taken a college course. And 17% of DACA recipients have gone to college and earned a bachelor's or master's degree. A 2017 national DACA survey conducted by Dr. Tom Wong at the University of California, San Diego, found that DACA recipients outpace the general population in terms of business creation. Phasing out DACA or canceling the program altogether will also negatively impact the country's investment in human capital. When earnings increase, people have increased spending power, and states have certainly benefited from this program. Dr. Wong's survey found that 2/3 of respondents reported spending around $16,000 on the purchase of their first car, and 16% of survey respondents had purchased their first home. These findings were for survey respondents who were 25 and older, and there are not only respective and ongoing taxes that are paid when it comes to these purchases, but these purchases cultivate job growth and energize local economies. To summarize, according to the Congressional Budget Office, if high levels of dreamers were to be deported or self-deported, which the Trump administration has stated is an objective, the workforce would shrink, leading to lower economic growth, declining tax revenues, and a decrease in the worker to retiree ratio, making it even more difficult to support America's rapidly aging population. A recent study conducted by the IZA Institute of Labor Economics found that if the DREAM Act were to be passed when it was proposed, the federal deficit would be reduced by $0.7 billion or more per year. There are approximately 9 million people in the United States that are part of mixed status families. And so when we speak about ending the program and or self-deportation of DACA recipients, this conversation is not just insular to DACA recipients. For example, it has been reported that DACA reduced the likelihood of poverty for households with eligible individuals by 38%. When a recipient loses DACA status, so do family members and communities. Finally, if protecting DACA recipients benefits all Americans, imagine the gains that we could make if there was comprehensive immigration reform. So DACA recipients are not eligible to receive Medicaid and Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act. Some states, such as California, have created separate state-funded programs so immigrants can access health care. The only other ways for DACA recipients to get health insurance is by receiving it from an employer, being a spouse's dependent, going to a community clinic, or purchasing it on their own outside of the exchange and paying the entire premium. Despite the challenges in accessing healthcare, the positive effects of DACA are not limited to the economy and labor. DACA has had positive public health outcomes for DACA recipients and their families. Upon receiving DACA and before the Trump administration, a nationally representative study conducted by Dr. Roberto Gonzalez, director of the National Undocumented Research Project, found that DACA had decreased anxiety, increased professional and academic aspirations, and promoted a sense of belonging. A 2017 survey conducted by the Center for American Progress indicated that about 57% of DACA recipients had secured a job with health insurance and other benefits. Other studies have also proven that DACA has substantially improved the mental health of eligible individuals. These studies contribute to the growing body of evidence that establish links between immigration policy choices and health outcomes. To illustrate, on the left-hand side, there is an infographic that demonstrates a mother's DACA eligibility was associated with decreased anxiety disorders for their children. Research indicates that the status of being undocumented promotes an intergenerational transmission of disadvantage due to the health inequities that exist. To quote the authors of the study, protecting unauthorized immigrants for deportation led to immediate and sizable improvements in the mental health of their U.S. citizen children. And expanding DACA, quote, could further promote the health and well-being of this next generation of American citizens. Eliminating DACA means thousands are at risk of losing their jobs as well as their access to employer-backed insurance plans. For those who have bought into private insurance plans, a loss of a job and income means it's harder to make monthly payments in the event that their insurers allow them to keep a policy without a Social Security number. Most private insurers require a Social Security number. So again, the implications of DACA and public health are not limited to DACA recipients, but also impact health outcomes for families and communities. Due to the limited amount of time, I'm not able to discuss how anti-immigrant policies impact health outcomes for ethnic minorities. But if you're interested in learning more, there are two publications that provide a timely discussion. The first is titled Fear by Association, Perceptions of Anti-Immigrant Policy and Health Outcomes by Dr. Edward Vargas, Gabriel Sanchez, Melina Juarez, and Mixed Status Families and WIC Uptake, the Effects of Risk Deportation on Program Use by Drs. Edward Vargas and Maureen Pirog. And if you had the pleasure of attending the APPAM conference, immediate past president Dr. Caroline Heinrich gave a presidential address titled 1,000 Petty Fortresses, Administrative Burden in U.S. Immigration Policies and Its Consequences, which described the implications of administrative burden on immigrants and their U.S.-born children. You can access that in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management.
Great. Sayal, there was a question for Sayal for a point of clarification that someone wanted you to repeat the options that DACA recipients have to obtain health insurance coverage. If you could just quickly repeat those, and we'll make sure that folks could, have more of a discussion about this afterwards. But if you could repeat that.
Yeah, so the only ways for DACA recipients to get health insurance is by receiving it from an employer, being a spouse's dependent, going to a community clinic, or purchasing it on their own outside of the exchange and paying the entire premium. However, there are some states, such as California, that have created separate state-funded programs so immigrants can access health care. So it also depends on where the immigrant lives.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Sure. So this slide asks, how do almost 1 million families function while living in legal limbo? At our Undocu Ally training in Tennessee, and to quote a brilliant DACA recipient, she responded and said, "Other students thrive and we have to struggle to survive." They described having DACA status akin to being forced to be on a roller coaster, waking up each day wondering how national policy was going to impact their day-to-day life and if it would prevent them from pursuing an education. And I share this because as educators, we need to ensure that our educational spaces are affirmational to the undocumented student identity, recognize the unique needs of undocumented students, and seek to promote not just in access, but in retention as well. Many of us that are on this call work at universities that espouse commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Academic excellence necessitates diversity. So what are we doing in our respective campuses during the social political climate to ensure the safety and well-being of our immigrant communities and academic spaces? This question is all the more pressing given that DACA has opened the doorway for undocumented students to pursue a post-secondary degree, technical trade, and/or professional licensure. And the graph on the left-hand side demonstrates that almost half, 44.9%, of DACA recipients are enrolled in school. DACA students do not have access to federal financial aid, and their education opportunities are also linked to state-level immigration policies, such as their ability to access in-state tuition and financial aid. So to illustrate the disparate educational access, approximately 20 states in the US have tuition-related law or policies that allow undocumented students to pay in-state tuition. And this is different from financial aid. And some are more inclusive than others. However, there are current measures that are aimed at rescinding in-state tuition, for example, in Connecticut and Texas. And just as problematic, in at least 7 states, including Georgia and South Carolina, universities block undocumented students from attending college as residents and from getting financial aid. Similarly, local policies do not just affect college access, as an increasing number of DACA recipients pursue technical degrees and/or professional licenses. Different states have different requirements that unfortunately prevent DACA recipients from practicing within their field. As undocumented students contend with their vulnerable statuses, educators have an opportunity to work alongside undocumented students, amplify their perspective, and pass institutional policies and practices that combat anti-immigrant federal and state legislation. As an example, you can access undocumented student programming and resources that are offered by the University of California and most recently Harvard University. And it's my obligation to state that these resources have been institutionalized at college campuses and are the hard-won efforts of the undocumented student movement. Their advocacy has improved campus climate. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sayil. I really appreciate you sharing all of the information about how this is affecting those who are recipients of this policy, as well as their families and our larger economy and community. Julia Delat is with the Migration Policy Institute as a senior policy analyst, and she is now going to share more about what's next with DACA and where she's an expert in all of what's going on in terms of the legal challenges, as well as what the prospects are for any legislative changes. And I welcome Julia to share with us your expertise.
Thanks, Cynthia, and thanks to you and Megan for organizing the webinar. As Cynthia said, I'm a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, or MPI. MPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization based in Washington, D.C., and we conduct research and policy analysis on a wide range of topics related to immigration and immigrant integration, both worldwide and here in the United States. My own background is in sociology and demography. I've been here at MPI for about 1.5 years after spending 3.5 years at the Urban Institute after graduate school. Bringing my skills to MPI, I've been involved in research on immigration enforcement, the characteristics of DACA holders, some analysis about the H-1B program for high-skilled temporary workers, and I'm currently involved in updating MPI's data on unauthorized immigrants. And I'm going to talk a bit about what the future might hold for DACA or other protections for Dreamers, both in Congress and in the courts. So when President Trump ended the DACA program, this put great pressure on Congress to pass some kind of protections for Dreamers and put those protections into legislation rather than having the protections be done through executive action. And late last year and early this year, it seemed like there was a chance that the president and Congress could create a legislative fix and work out a deal. And public support is really strongly behind passing some kind of permanent protections for Dreamers. A majority of Americans say they support this. That support is at around 66 to 87%, depending on the poll question. And support is high for Republicans as well as Democrats. Strong majorities of Republicans, as high as 80%, support a path to legal status for Dreamers, along with as much as over 90% of Democrats. But despite this strong support, the negotiations in Congress became really complicated when the White House and Republican leaders in Congress asked for a number of things in exchange for protections for Dreamers. They asked for funding for the border wall, and they asked for big changes to the U.S. permanent immigration system, specifically cuts to some family-sponsored immigration categories. The end of the negotiations came when the Senate voted on 3 bills on February 15th this year. There was a bipartisan compromise that would have combined protections for Dreamers with minor changes to the legal immigration system and $25 billion in border wall funding. There was the McCain-Coons bill, which paired protections for Dreamers with some border security measures, but no wall funding. And there was the Secure and Succeed Act by Senator Grassley. That was the favored bill of the White House. It offered protections for Dreamers with, again, $25 billion in wall funding, major cuts to the U.S. legal immigration system, and other measures to increase interior immigration enforcement. And this chart on the slide shows MPI's estimates of how many Dreamers could have received protections under each of these bills, plus a fourth that didn't get a vote. Ultimately, none of the bills got the 60 votes needed to move forward. And in any event, the prospects of these bills in the House were uncertain. And I was prepared to say here that given the midterm elections that are looming, it's really unlikely that Congress will take up any DACA or DREAM legislation until at least next year. However, there was a pretty interesting development in the House yesterday. So a small group of Republicans has launched an effort to put immigration on the floor, even though Speaker Paul Ryan has been trying to prevent that. They filed something called a discharge petition. It's a rarely used procedure that would force a floor debate using an obscure House rule called the Queen of the Hill rule. In short, basically, if they can get a majority of House members to sign on, that will set up a vote, probably in June, on 4 different bills. And whichever of the bills gets the most votes and gets at least 50% of the House to vote for it would pass the House. So the bills are similar to the set before the Senate. There's an enforcement-heavy bill by Goodlatte, which pairs just temporary status for DACA recipients with a host of enforcement measures and cuts to legal immigration. There's a standalone DREAM Act, just a path to citizenship for DACA recipients and other Dreamers. There's the USA Act, which pairs legalization for Dreamers with some border security enhancements. And then the fourth slot would be up to Paul Ryan to decide which bill would go in. It's probably a long shot that this will go forward. The Republicans are still gathering signatures at this point, but it will be interesting to watch this. And if this fails, I do think that we'll have to wait for next year to see any action on DREAM legislation. As Congress was debating DACA bills, as Matt mentioned, the courts have also been really busy ruling on whether the administration had the right to end DACA in the way that it did. Immigration advocacy groups sued the government immediately after the end of DACA, saying the government didn't take the necessary steps and it didn't justify its reasoning. To date, 4 district courts have ruled. One court in Maryland said that the government did have the right to end DACA in the way that it did. And then 3 courts have said that the government did not end DACA properly. Those are in California, New York, and DC. Importantly, as Matt mentioned, 2 of these courts put an injunction in place that ordered the government to allow people with DACA to continue to be able to renew their status. So right now, anyone who has ever had DACA can apply to renew if they need to, even if their DACA expired, even if they let it lapse for long periods. This has put the DACA program on a kind of life support, but this ruling is under appeal now to the Ninth Circuit Court. And then 2 weeks ago, the DC District Court, the third court that said the government didn't have the right to end DACA, said that if the government can't clarify the reasoning for ending the program within 90 days, the government will be ordered to again start accepting initial DACA applications. This means that anyone who never applied for DACA, either they couldn't afford it or they hadn't gotten around to it or they weren't old enough yet, would be able to apply. This is particularly important for those who were just aging into DACA eligibility. And then in another new twist last week, the Texas Attorney General and 6 other states asked a Texas court to rule that the DACA program was unlawful. And they've also asked for a preliminary injunction, but this would ask the court to order the Trump administration not to issue any more DACA renewals or initial DACA grants. And this is unlikely to be heard until at least July. So what could happen is a pretty interesting situation where one court is telling the government that it has to accept DACA applications, another court is telling the government it can't accept DACA applications, and either one judge is going to have to change their ruling or the Supreme Court will have to step in to resolve the conflict. So this is interesting for court watchers, but the bottom line is that if someone has ever had DACA, they can apply to renew. If they've never had DACA, they cannot apply. But things could change in the next 90 days or over the summer as more courts rule. And then I wanted to end with just a few words about the role of evidence versus politics and policymaking around DACA. Congress's decision-making on DREAM DACA legislation is affected by a mix of evidence and politics. MPI is not a lobbying organization, so I don't have a full view of what legislators were considering as they debated the bills, but I do know what questions we got at MPI from members of Congress, and I've talked with people who spent more time on the Hill. And what we heard is that legislators were really interested a lot in numbers. They wanted to know how many people would benefit from any particular DREAM legislation. Bills had different rules around the age of entry for eligibility or the year of entry or maximum age at an application, and those changed the numbers of Dreamers who might be eligible, and legislators really wanted to know how many people might benefit from a given bill. They were also interested in how many family members legalizing Dreamers would sponsor for green cards. The White House put out some information making it sound like many, many family members could be sponsored, which is unlikely to be true. That raised some red flags. And at MPI, we estimated that Dreamers would sponsor at most one family member over their lifetime if given a path to legal status. Legislators were interested in how many DACA holders or how many Dreamers were in their particular district or in their state. They did cite the evidence on how well DACA holders were doing, the percentage who are working or in school. There was a lot of interest around DACA holders serving in particular roles, such as teachers or serving in the military. And last but not least, legislators love hearing and love telling compelling individual stories. I think there's a real role for qualitative research here. Members of Congress are really influenced by hearing about someone in their district affected by a particular policy, and DACA is no exception to this. So on the other hand, Republican members of Congress were in a politically difficult spot in voting, and they remain in voting on DACA or DREAM legislation. They may be convinced about the benefits of DACA to DACA holders or communities. They may be sympathetic, but if their district or state went for President Trump, it was difficult to support a bill that the president didn't stand behind or was actively attacking. So these politics may shift depending on what happens with the midterm elections. After that, we may have a better sense of the long-term future for DREAM Act-like legislation. Until then, we'll have to watch the courts or to watch this really interesting process going on in the House right now.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you to all three of our panelists for really providing a broad overview as well as great detail on these elements. And we are getting some questions in, and so I do encourage all of you who are participating to submit your questions, and we will try to get them all answered. If you don't mind kind of addressing a particular person in your question to let me know who it is that you would like to address your question. And also just to remind those who may have joined later, this is being recorded and it will be made available to everyone afterwards. So there's one question, Julia, that I think that maybe you could clarify. And the question says that not all DACA eligible or recipients are dreamers. And if you could describe what the differences and or the overlap between these two groups are, and whether there is something substantially different.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think there's any official definition of what a dreamer is. People generally use it to mean somebody who is an unauthorized immigrant who entered the United States as a child, and they may not have been the person to make the migration decision. Their parents likely made the decision, and they came along as a child. There are more dreamers than there are people eligible for DACA because of the particular requirements around DACA having entered, before age 16, having been under age 31 in 2012. So the whole pool of people who entered the United States as children who are unauthorized immigrants is larger than the 1.3 million that we estimate at MPI who are eligible for DACA. But beyond that, I wouldn't be able to speak to the distinction.
Great. So there is a question, and I believe it was for Sail, that is about kind of whose responsibility it is to help these children become documented, and why it is a public issue, why it's the government's responsibility versus the responsibility of their families. And I think that you provided a lot of evidence that this has public consequences if these folks are deported or lose their jobs. But why is it the responsibility of the government to help them become documented and not their families?
Well, we have to look at the reasons why people migrated into this country and the role of the United States in creating social political instability from those countries. And then also as a country, we support their education from K through 12 and we invest in the well-being of the people who live here. The current migration system is broken. To give a very specific example, it took me approximately 15 years to receive my permanent residency. And that's not an atypical amount of time. So right now, there aren't any real pathways to citizenships. Families, of course, would like to, quote, fix papers, become legal, but when there isn't a means to do it, then people are just surviving and the country is benefiting from people living here.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone else wanted to respond to that question either, but Matt, I wanted to address one to you, and perhaps this is something that you could provide insight on and whether there's research to support. What are the major determinants on undocumented eligible youth to apply for DACA for the first time? Who is it that applies, and perhaps who is it that doesn't?
Yeah, we actually don't have a lot of great information on those kind of gaps in uptake. what we do know, and this is just largely due to data limitations, is the geographic variability in uptake. And there's been some work done by Audrey Singer, who is at Brookings and now I believe is at CRS, who documented some pretty stark spatial differences in where eligible DACA recipients are actually taking up DACA, and really highlighted the role that advocacy organizations and institutions play in helping to facilitate that. But certainly, there has been and is increasingly fear around registering for a program that is not only has an uncertain future, but is outing people as being undocumented. So
Yeah.
The fact that by MPI estimates, just over half of the eligible DACA population is actually receiving it is an important point of discussion.
Julia mentioned that there was a cost to the application. Perhaps you mentioned, and I'm not remembering, but what is the cost to do this? How much is that a deterrent?
I actually don't know exactly what the cost is. Julia, do you want to chime in here to clarify?
Sure. I believe it's $495. So, and that is a cost that someone would have to pay on their initial application as well as every 2 years if they wanted to keep renewing.
Okay, that's substantial. Julia, there's a question for you and we have some folks who are telling us the cost. Thank you for that to the audience. Julia, a question to you about the two decisions in local courts that are going to be deciding on the two different directions on DACA. When is their ruling deadline? You mentioned that July, if both decided that this, I'm sorry, I'm trying to just make sure to paraphrase. If both decide the Supreme Court would need to intervene, and when would that be, when's that estimated time? So I guess when do we expect that these things will be resolved or move on to the Supreme Court?
That's a really good question, and I wish I had a clearer answer than I do. What I know is that, so the Texas court that has been asked to rule that DACA was an unlawful program, the earliest that they would consider that and rule would be July, but it could be later than that. The other piece that's pending is the injunctions that mean that DACA renewals are still being accepted. That has been appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court, and I'm not sure exactly the timeline for that. The government had also asked the Supreme Court to jump ahead of the Ninth Circuit Court and review one of the DACA cases ahead, and the Supreme Court said, no, we'd like the Ninth Circuit Court to rule first. So it will be a while before the Ninth Circuit Court can rule, and then if the Texas court were to rule as well, that could be appealed as well before it went to the Supreme Court. So this is all just to say I'm not exactly sure of the timeline, but it will be quite a while. It will be a slow process, and there are many steps to go through first.
What is the best resource for someone to follow this sort of kind of unfolding events? Does your organization have all this information summarized? Is there a place that folks are following that they can stay apprised of all of the things that are happening?
That's a good question. We are trying to stay on top of it, and we publish on immigration policy topics monthly, but the topics rotate. The National Immigration Law Center might be a place that's closely tracking the courts and may be good about keeping an updated website of information. United We Dream is an unauthorized immigrant-led organization, and they usually have good information about the current status. So I would look to those two resources, and we'll try to put out information at MPI as best we can as well.
Great, thank you. So I encourage others to type your questions into the box for to identify a particular speaker that you would like to address your question. And so I'm trying to both monitor the box and talk at the same time. We have another question that has come in for Sail, I believe, to tell about where we can find the differences across states regarding the health community center and state-funded programs that DACA can use. So a reference for information about health care access by states.
Care access by state. Oh, I know that United We Dream has published briefs on it. I cannot think of one at this moment. Could we add it to the webinar, like in a comment, and I can pull up resources?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We also, on the last slide, each of your email addresses is posted, and I know that you all agreed to allowing folks to be able to contact you directly to get information if they would like. But if we have that as a reference, and we can post that as part of this, within the webinar, so that would be wonderful if you can provide that.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, I didn't know if Matt or Julia has more information about where kind of state level differences in some of these policies are best tracked.
I would actually also mention the National Immigration Law Center for that. They have a big focus on public benefits, and I know in the past they've had some maps up of availability, but they may, somewhere on their website, if someone's persistent to hunt around, may have good information about that. We were tracking it at the Urban Institute, but not specifically for DACA holders. But if people are interested in state variation and public benefits policies more generally, the Urban Institute does have, it's updated through 2016, a map of different state public benefits policies for immigrants, both non-citizens and unauthorized immigrants.
Great. We're also seeing that there is a question saying that MPI has compiled a document that lists data sources for studying immigration issues. So Julia, thank you to your organization for that. But are there any that you think would be particularly promising for understanding the costs and challenges of gaining access to legal status and citizenship?
Good question. We have a paper, it's called something like Going to the Back of the Line, that talks about the long and difficult process for obtaining green cards. And to go back to the first question, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that many people who are on DACA have signed up for DACA because they don't have other legal options. They, under U.S. immigration law, we have these 3- and 10-year bars to re-entry. And so if somebody has been an unauthorized immigrant for a certain amount of time in the country, they're not able to get legal status without leaving the country for 10 years and being separated from their job and their family and their social networks for 10 years. So there's not a viable path for many people. I believe that report lays out some of those challenges. In terms of the costs, I can't think of anything immediately.
This is Sail. I found it. So it's by the Urban Institute. It's the State Immigration Policy Resource, and the resource compiles state-level immigrant and immigration policies on 3 major areas: enforcement, public benefit, access, and integration. And so this also helps keep track of which states are more anti-immigrant than others, and this is a really good state-by-state level resource.
Great. Great.
I'll just jump in here too. This is Matt, on some of the work on the economic impact of DACA. Both Cato and the Center for American Progress have both put out reports that have detailed the impacts of repealing DACA, and both those reports are available online and are quite good.
Excellent. I think this question is either for Julia or Matt, of whether there is an estimate on how many DACA recipients have been able to apply or receive residency through other legal channels, such as their employer or family-based. So have any of these folks found a pathway to citizenship who were protected by DACA?
There is an estimate floating around, and I want to say it's about 40,000, but let me see if I can confirm that while we're talking. And these are people who most likely had come to the United States on a legal visa and overstayed that visa rather than coming across the border. That allows somebody to have an opportunity that if they find an employer sponsor, more likely if they marry a U.S. citizen, that they could be sponsored for a green card. There was another provision of DACA advanced parole where people could get permission from the government to travel abroad and come back in, and that set them up in a position where they no longer faced that 10-year bar as well. And if they were to marry a U.S. citizen, could be sponsored for a green card. So there were a small share who were able to get green cards.
Great. I didn't know if Matt, if you had any other information on that, but
yeah, no, I think that's a good summary by Julia.
Yeah. I think one of the things to kind of put in perspective here, we've talked about how rescinding DACA will have a negative influence on our economy. And to help us to think about how the number of DACA recipients that are in our country compare to the number of other undocumented folks, and whether all of our attention is being spent on this small group, and what is going on with the other 10 million or so who are not protected by DACA. Do you have any kind of perspective on that?
Was this question for me?
Sure, Sayal, that would be great.
Oh, yeah, so the narratives from DACA recipients are extreme anxiety and guilt because they've been afforded this privilege, and they realize that they have a lot of responsibility in also caring for their families and are oftentimes main or even sole providers. And what's been very frustrating also for the undocumented youth is this dreamer narrative that has come out, and in some ways it speaks to the resilience of undocumented people and how they're able to persist despite all of these challenges, but at the same time it perpetuates a good immigrant myth, and so their parents are perceived as sort of these rule breakers, and it's really not a conversation of, well, it's a life and death situation, what would you do for your family, because this is what my family did for me. And I think that right now, with the undocumented activists that I work with, the conversation has always gone back to the 11 million, but that's just simply not on the table. When I was undocumented, being undocumented was very much like being in the closet. You just didn't acknowledge your status. You didn't talk about it. You just hoped things would change. And I really just want to acknowledge the courage and the power that the movement has had in sort of allowing folks to reclaim what it means to be undocumented and outing themselves and coming out of the shadows. It's allowed for us to have, I think, a more honest conversation about the 11 million undocumented people that are in this country.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, are there any final words from any of the panelists in terms of, what it is that folks should take away from this webinar as we kind of watch this unfold in the courts and hopefully something resolved in our legislation? Matt, do you have any closing remarks?
I would just say that this is a constantly evolving process, and that the other piece of this that we don't want to lose sight of is that there are other related statuses to DACA, such as temporary protected status, and Julie had mentioned advanced parole, that affect undocumented individuals in similarly kind of precarious ways. And so the uncertainty that and the kind of limbo that documented folks are in right now is affecting actually a much broader group of migrants and communities.
Yeah. Well, I thank you, all three of you, for sharing this information with us today. It's been really both informative and kind of helpful as we think through what's going to come in the next couple of months, hopefully, that some of these issues will be resolved. And I think for everyone who actually participated on the webinar this morning, it is recorded. It will be posted, and all of the references that our panelists have been mentioning will be posted at appam.org. And again, they're and mine, but they have much more information than I. Email addresses are listed on this last slide, and they would welcome any direct questions that you have to them. So thank you again for participating this morning, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.